To have been a citizen in the area of Gettysburg in the days and months after the three-day battle would have meant being surrounded by death almost everywhere you went. Like there would be the smell of rotting corpses constantly filling your nostrils. And in places like this, the wheat field, where so much violent fighting had taken place, and where so many dead soldiers were buried in shallow, hastily dug graves, well, it wouldn't be uncommon to walk through here and maybe see the partially decomposed hand of a soldier sticking up above the soil, or part of their head, or to maybe have your dog bring up the femur of a Confederate or Union soldier to your front porch. So it was a terrible scene that they had going on around here, and something had to be done. So it was decided by the Pennsylvania governor to commission a man by the name of David Wills, who was a local attorney, to do something to get these soldiers reinterred in a central location. So 17 acres was bought in the area that is adjacent to Evergreen Cemetery, and a man by the name of Samuel Weaver was hired, and for $1.59 per corpse, he dug up over 3,500 Union soldiers and reinterred them in what is now the National Cemetery. Now, in November of that year, while burials were still going on, they decided to have a dedication ceremony. And at this dedication ceremony, Abraham Lincoln is going to deliver one of the most famous speeches of all time. All right, well, I am currently in the very center of Gettysburg, which at the time would have been called the Diamond, and then became known as the Square, and I think it's now called the Circle. So I don't know, there's some geometric challenges that are going on here in the middle of Gettysburg, and it's quite busy today, which is honestly appropriate, because on November 19th, the day that the dedication of the Gettysburg National Cemetery was to take place, this would have been a hive of activity. And Lincoln, who had been invited to come and say a few appropriate words by David Wills, had arrived the night before and stayed in this home right here, the David Wills house. Alright, so here is the David Wills house, which unfortunately is closed down right now, so we can't go inside, but this is the home that Abraham Lincoln stayed in on the night of November 18th, before the dedication ceremony. And there's a common misconception that he wrote the Gettysburg Address here. That's not true. He already had it prepared, but it is reasonable to assume that he maybe kind of polished it a little bit while staying here and rehearsed it for the next day's ceremonies. And it was from this point that Lincoln was going to set out with a crowd of people and walk all the way down Baltimore Street to the site of the Soldiers National Cemetery. Alright, so we just left the square, and I'm actually kind of glad, because that place is crazy. It's a good place to get your car hit. And what we're going to do is we're going to kind of follow the path of Abraham Lincoln as he walked from the Wills house to the cemetery, and look at some of the things that he might have seen. Like this home right here, which belonged to a man named George Heck. He also would have walked by the home of Tilly Pierce, a young girl who wrote about her experiences during the Battle of Gettysburg after the war. And also would have walked next to the Shriver house, where Hetty and her two young daughters came back after the battle to find their house completely wrecked. He also would have passed by the home of Mrs. Garlock, where on the first day of the battle, General Schimmelpfennig hid out for 3 days behind her house, and where she secretly fed him whenever she would go out to feed the hogs. As Lincoln and the crowd came down Baltimore Street, they would have also passed in front of Harvey Sweeney's home and the tannery that would have been next door. Perhaps someone would have pointed out all of the bullet holes in the side of Sweeney's house. As an aside, Harvey Sweeney gives us one of the best accounts of what it would have looked like during that day in November whenever the ceremony was being held. We also know that across from the Sweeney home, Lincoln would have passed not in front of a tree like this one, but this very tree right here. This is what is called a witness tree, and it was alive and growing and still lives today. But yeah, Lincoln would have passed right by this tree and also that one down there in the distance. Perhaps Lincoln would have passed within sight of the Jenny Wade house on his way to the cemetery, where the only civilian to die during the Battle of Gettysburg was shot while making bread for Union soldiers. After making their way through town, Lincoln and the crowd would have made their way to Cemetery Hill and walked up to the top just in the same way that we are now, and would have been in the same position that the Union artillery would have been positioned during the Battle of Gettysburg. And up here on top of the hill, there would have been a platform where currently the Evergreen Cemetery is, just on the other side of that fence. And where we are standing is the same place where about 20,000 people would have stood and listened to the keynote speaker that day, who was not Abraham Lincoln, by the way. It was a orator and speechmaker who was very popular at the time by the name of Edward Everett. And we would have stood here and listened to Everett give his speech for 2 hours. After the speech, there would have been a hymn, and then Lincoln would have taken the stage, and in 2 minutes would have delivered the most powerful speech, one of the most powerful speeches ever given in American history. And these are the words that he spoke. 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth upon this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty, and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation, or any nation so conceived and so dedicated, can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that that nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. But in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here have consecrated it far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little note, nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living rather, to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus so far nobly advanced. It is rather for us here to be dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion, that we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. And that was it. A lot of people in the audience were completely shocked at how short the speech was, but some realized the impact of it in the moment, including Edward Everett, who said that Lincoln had accomplished more in 2 minutes than he had in 2 hours. With the Gettysburg Address, Lincoln was not only able to, I guess, solidify the meaning of the war, but also to assure the audience and an even larger scope, the nation, that the sacrifice that was being paid to keep this country together was not being paid in vain. Pretty amazing to stand in this place and reflect on the history that happened right here on November 19th, 1863.